Okay, I must confess, I said we're going to start chapter 3 today, and I meant to get the outline, get the contents copied, but I'm a little sleep deprived because we had 2 weddings, one last Sunday night, one the Sunday night before, and in between celebrations, so every night was late, and I didn't get it done. I'll read it to you and translate it for you, and hopefully by tomorrow I'll have it ready for you. The first 2 chapters, which we have studied, were dealing with the mitzvah of Teshuvah and the details of how it's applied and some of the background. In chapter 3, the Rambam starts talking about general philosophical subjects, of which in the 10 chapters there's a great deal of material. So he starts by saying, every person, Kol echad ve'echad b'nei ha'adam. That's as specific as you could possibly get. Every person has merits and transgressions, which means that every person has some failures. This is really based on a verse in Ecclesiastes, in Koheles, which says, Ein Adam Sadiq ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov v'lo yechta. Some people, when they quote it, leave out the word Adam. That's a mistake. There's no person righteous in the world who will do good and not fail. Well, that book was written with what we call Ruach HaKodesh, which is Holy Spirit, which should make it infallible. Nevertheless, the Talmud challenges that statement by citing 4 people who we have on record as having died through the strategy of the snake which seduced Adam and Chava into eating from the tree of knowledge, which brought death into the world. I'm speaking now for the other commentaries. Rambam doesn't agree with that exactly, but okay, I'm not going to go into that at the moment. And if they died, so presumably if they died only because of the strategy of the snake, it means they had no faults of their own, which means their lives were free of failure. So, the Gemara says that these 4 people did indeed get through their lives without failure. And Tosfos explains that verses which are stated in universal language tolerate exceptions. Now, we have spoken about this in rabbinical literature. There, the rabbinical literature is on record itself by saying universal statements tolerate exceptions. And if you are, well, you should guard yourself against being so chauvinistic as to think, well, then they're just logically sloppy. You know, you've been taught about diversity, not correctly, but you've been taught about it. When you read a text, you have to take it in a culture, as part of the expression of a culture, and the culture determines how the text is meant to be understood. So when a text says all A's are B's, is it meant that every A in the universe, past, present, and future, is a B? Or does it mean A's are generally B's? Or there is some kind of natural feature which makes A's into B's but doesn't always work? What does the culture understand by those words? And we're being told that both in Scripture and in rabbinic writing, statements in universal language tolerate exceptions. They're not meant to be absolute. That's not the way they're understood. That's not what they communicate. And indeed, there are places in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, where it's very obvious and outstanding, because the problem is right on the surface. When Moses is standing at the burning bush, and he says, when I go to Egypt, people won't believe me when I tell them that I'm coming to rescue them, and the creator of the universe is on their side. So God says to him, they'll believe you. And I'm going to give you some ways to convince them. He says to him, take your staff, throw it down. Wooden staff becomes a snake. And so pick it up, he picks it up, becomes a staff of wood again. Says, that's in order that they should believe. We'll see that, they'll believe. And if they don't believe that, so then I'm going to give you another one. put your hand into your garment, takes it out and is leprous, put it back in, it takes it out, it's not leprous. If they don't believe the first sign, they will believe the second sign. That's what's written there. They will believe the second sign. The next words are, and if they don't believe the second sign, so wait a second, you just said they will, and now you say if they don't? Right, because they will doesn't mean necessarily, universally, without question, without exception, infallibly. It means they ought to, it would be appropriate, it could be expected, but it's not closed, because that's the way this text talks. In Deuteronomy, we had just a couple of weeks ago, one verse says, you should be careful to lend money to people who are impoverished, because there will always be impoverished people in your land. And another verse says, there will be no impoverished people. And they're separated by 8 verses, so almost back to back. And it means that if you fulfill the requirements that I'm setting before you, and the future develops in the way that we hope and pray that it will develop, then there won't be any impoverished people. But there is always the possibility that you will fail, in which case there will be impoverished people. So this mode of expression isn't absolute. So Tosfos is certainly justified in saying that although the verse in Ecclesiastes says everyone will fail, it doesn't mean that there are no exceptions. Other commentaries say, other commentaries solve the problem by reading the statement in the Talmud very, very carefully, very precisely. All the statement of the Talmud said is that they died because of the strategy of the snake. Perhaps they did fail, but the failure wasn't serious enough to justify death. So yes, these 4 died by the strategy of the snake, but they had other failures. And those failures were too minor to justify that. Therefore, the verse in Ecclesiastes would be 100% true. At any rate, Maimonides is taking the position that everyone has merits and everyone has at least some failures. Now, we're studying the laws of Teshuvah, which is roughly translated as repentance. Those are from the beginning know what the definition is. This makes the process of Teshuvah extremely important, because it means that at some point in life there are going to be failures, but you could repair them. Which means that even if everyone is going to fail sooner or later, everyone could leave the world clean. Everyone could leave the world with a perfect record, because there's a way to repair the failures. So it doesn't mean that everyone is condemned to be a failure. Everyone is set in a position where there will be failures, but there's a process that's provided whereby you can rectify the failures. I think that's an absolutely crucial idea. Yeah.
So then it's also essential to the way the world operates, that there will be the correction. Like, it's also essential to the world that there will be misdeeds and corrections. It's essential that there is also correction.
I don't know what you mean by essential. There's a means for correction is provided, and you have the ability to use it. It's not guaranteed that you will use it.
No, right. But I mean, it's almost intrinsic that we will fall.
Yes.
And there is a mechanism to repair the fall.
That's right.
But almost necessarily we will fall. Like the Torah constantly tells us we fail this and this and this. We are kind of destined.
I hear in your words, so you're raising a question which I think is a genuine question, and I'll tell you what some have said, and I'm not totally satisfied that I understand their answer, or that I have an answer to the question altogether. What does this say about free will? What do you mean everybody fails? If everyone has free will, it ought to at least be possible for someone to have a perfect record and never fall. Now, the Maharal says something here. He's addressing the question, but I don't understand his answer. He says as follows. Let's go back to that verse in Ecclesiastes. It's really a very rich verse. Almost every word has commentaries explaining what it contributes to the verse. We're going to concentrate on one word. Ein Adam Sadiq. There's no person righteous, ba'aretz. Now, Oretz means in the world, but Oretz refers to the planet. Eretz is ground. So it means there's no person in the world, our world, Well, where did you think people were? Were you contrasting that with people on Mars or in space or in, the size of nanometers? I mean, what are we learning from the word in the world? So the Maharal says that word is there to teach you the reason why there will always be some failure. And he cites a famous verse and commentary from the first chapter of Genesis, when the Creator says to the earth, bring forth fruit trees bearing fruit. Eitz pri osa pri. Fruit trees bearing fruit. And the verse says, the earth brought forth eitz osa pri. Trees bearing fruit. Which, as you understand, was not exactly what it was told. It was told to bring forth fruit trees bearing fruit. And it didn't do that. It brought forth trees bearing fruit, but not fruit trees bearing fruit. What does that mean? So some say because the body of the tree would taste like the fruit, instead of now tasting like bark. So what does it mean? God ordered the earth to do something, and the earth didn't comply? So the Maharal says, don't fool yourself. The earth has no free will. It's not responsible. It didn't commit a crime. But God was illustrating something, that when you talk to the Oretz, and you talk to Oretz, to earth, from the position of the heavens, there's a gap. There's a necessary gap, and the earth cannot completely fulfill a command coming from the heavens. That's what this case is designed to illustrate. And therefore, he says, the verse from Ecclesiastes, which is talking about people, where it says there's no person righteous in the earth who will do good and not fail. The verse means to tell you that just like the earth didn't bring forth trees of the appropriate type because it's earth and can't completely fulfill a command from heaven, so the human being, because he's partly composed of earth, he has a material composition, partly, part of him is soul, which isn't material, but part of him is material. Therefore, he has an element which can't completely fulfill the command coming from heaven. That's what the Maharal says on this subject. But I think that still leaves the question in place. If it's really set up in such a way that it's impossible, so then why am I responsible for it? And why do I have to fix it? Why do I have to repair it? Now, I have heard a compromise position, but I'm not totally satisfied with it. Suppose I set up a situation in which I give you 50 things to do, and you have the ability to do 48. Any 48 you choose. And you exert your will, and you do the best that you can. But 2 you don't. But it could have been a different 2. So for each one, I could say, for that one, you chose to do it or not to do it. What's set up is that the totality of 50 is going to have failure somewhere. I'm still disturbed that that's not totally free will. The fact that you could choose where to make the failure doesn't mean that you could have escaped all failure. So I don't have a good answer to the question how to understand free will under these conditions. And I'm going to leave it at that because I don't. But Rambam is talking here about Teshuvah, which is the process of repair, and he starts by introducing the idea that everyone has things to repair. It means that in an ideal world, everyone will do at least some Teshuvah. Teshuvah is going to be a common element that embraces the whole population. Now, the Rambam goes on. A person whose merits are more than his transgressions is called a Sadiq. Now, the word Sadiq, which is roughly translated as righteous, that is a technical term, and it appears in different places with different definitions. So the Rambam is giving a definition here that fits this particular usage, but it's not universal. You know, it's a little bit like, I don't know if you studied these things, but if you studied evolutionary biology, you should be aware that the word species has about 8 different definitions. And depending upon the context, they pick which one to use. And when you study and you see results about species and so forth and so on, you'll have to ask, which kind of species do you mean? Oh, non-interbreeding populations? Try that on amoebae. Right? Amoebae don't breed that way at all. They just divide. So non-interbreeding population isn't going to help for that, or many plants which aren't dimorphic. Okay. So he's called a tzaddik, just more. Now we'll see that the word more has to be defined. He'll pick that up in a few lines. And he whose transgressions are more than his merits is called wicked. And someone who's 50-50 is called Benini, which means intermediate. And so it is for a group of people, like a city. If the merits of all the inhabitants are more than their transgressions, then that city, let's say, is righteous. And if their transgressions are more than their merits, then it is wicked. And the same is true for the world as a whole. Now, that may sound more or less obvious, but it isn't at all. Let's think about the city. Yeah, let's say 100 people. Now you're going to count up all the merits of each one. So you get 4,763. And you're going to count up the transgressions of all of them, add them up, and they get 2,504. Oh, look at that. The sum total of merits is superior to the sum total of transgressions, and therefore the city as a whole is righteous. Is there any other way you could have done it? Well, here's what you could have done. You could have looked at each person singly. Take each person and ask, are his merits more numerous than his transgressions, vice versa? If his merits are more numerous, then call him a tzaddik. Give him the tzaddik label, and go through one by one. You have the 100 people, and you could get 62 tzaddikim and 38 rishonim, and then go by the majority of people who are tzaddikim. That's a different way of counting. And they're not equal. For example, let's suppose of the 100 people, 80, each one of 80 has a majority of transgressions, but the majority is very small, 51 to 50. And suppose the last 20 are tzaddikim, but spectacular tzaddikim. All but one of every one of them is a merit. So the sum total of merits will outweigh the sum total of transgressions, but the number of wicked people is greater than the number of righteous people. Now you have to decide which way to go. And philosophically, it makes a big difference. Because in the description that I just gave you, where you have 80 people who are on balance wicked, just a little, but on balance they're failures, and 20 people who are spectacular successes, the excess of the successes saves the 80. It saves the great performance of the 20 enables the 80 to be saved from destruction. That's not an obvious move. Maybe each person should live on the basis of his own record and be determined on the basis of his own record. Here, the city as a whole isn't going to be destroyed because of the fact that the 20 contribute so much excess merit. Well, the Rambam is doing it in that way, that you take the sum total of the merits of the people as against sum total of the transgressions of the people, and you judge it on the basis of which is greater. And the same for the world as a whole. And now the Rambam says something extremely controversial. He says, a person whose transgressions are greater than his merits dies instantly. Dies instantly. Wow. Does that accord with our experience? Doesn't it seem like some awful people running around? Really awful. Hard to imagine that Putin's merits outweigh his transgressions. He's got a big record of transgressions, failures, crimes. And the same is true for the city, and the same is true for the world as a whole, and he quotes verses for this. Maimonides quotes verses for this. So already the Rambam's famous critic, the Rabbi, on the page says that he disagrees with this. It's simply not correct. And by the way, for those who know something about these matters, the Ravid wrote his criticisms of the whole of the Mishnah Torah, and they're printed together with the Mishnah Torah. And sometimes his language against the Rambam is quite sharp. This is a mistake. This is completely wrong. This has to be rejected. And people wonder, how could anybody speak against the Rambam with such sharp language? Well, here's the secret. The Ravid, the commentator, was older than the Rambam. He was earlier than the Rambam. He was an established Rosh Yeshiva and had an international reputation when the Rambam was an up-and-coming, starting scholar. And the Rambam's works started to be circulated, and the Ravid got hold of them and he said, let's see, here's this new fellow on the block. Let's see what he's doing. Let's see whether it's worthwhile. It isn't worthwhile. So therefore, he could treat him as an up-and-coming and as an inferior to a greater scholar who's already an established scholar. That's why he writes the way that he does. Certainly no insult or no lack of honor intended. The Rambam wasn't the great Rambam that we have. He hadn't achieved that stature yet. So he criticizes this statement as the way we would and says that it's very hard to understand what the Rambam is saying. It seems that our observations of life contradict it. The Kesef Mishnah, great commentator, says if you just keep reading in the Rambam, you'll see his explanation and you'll see how it could be true. So let's follow the Kesef Mishnah's suggestion and let's keep reading. He says, Shikol zeh, this weighing up, when I told you more merits than transgressions, or more transgressions than merits, this weighing up is not according to the number of merits and transgressions, but rather in terms of their relative weight, their size, their significance, their value. Lodlan. There is one merit which corresponds to many transgressions added together. He quotes a verse. And there is one transgression that corresponds to many merits. And he quotes another verse. So, it's a question of the weight, the size, the significance, the value of each of these actions to determine what counts as more, what counts as less. Now, who determines that? Now, if you were to ask me this question, I could make some suggestions. How about talking about the nature of the authority behind it? Maybe biblical commandments way more than rabbinic commandments. Or you could do it in terms of punishment. The more severe the punishment, then the more value, significance that the action has. And if you do it successfully, the more credit you get for doing it right. I could think of a number of different ways in which you could evaluate the size and significance of a merit or a transgression so as to make this calculation. The Rambam rejects all of that. He rejects all of that absolutely. And he says, this weighing up is only done in the knowledge and understanding of the Creator, whom he gives a title here, which is quoting from a pasuk, Kel Deos. Kel is a word for G-O-D, and Deos is a word that has many applications in Hebrew. But the Rambam himself, in a prior section of the Mishnah Torah, has a section called Hilchos Deos, and Deos there means character traits, not opinions, not principles, not beliefs, not knowledge, not intellectual at all. Character traits. God, who knows the character of each person, he is the one who has to evaluate the size, the significance, the value of each merit and each transgression. This verse comes from the poetry of Hannah, the prophet, where she gives birth to the prophet Shmuel, and where she describes the suffering that she had at the hand of her co-wife, Penina, who criticized her and degraded her. And she says roughly that God alone knows what she really meant, what was going on in her heart, what she claimed to be doing it on the basis of good principles. God knows, and he's the one who's going to have to evaluate. So Maimonides quotes that verse here to say that when you're talking about the relative weight of one mitzvah against another, or the relative weight of one transgression against another, the only one who can weigh them and evaluate them is God, who is Kel Deos. Now, if I put 2 and 2 together and hope to get 4, what the Rambam is saying is this. When you look at a person's action, there are 2 things to ask, 2 questions to ask. Number 1, what's the status of the action? And number 2, what's the status of the agent? Now, it's usually much, much easier to assess the status of the action than the status of the agent. Was the action legal or illegal? If it was illegal, was it a misdemeanor? Was it a felony? What kind of punishment does the action call for in terms of the statutory law? These are questions which are objective and not too difficult to decide. When you come to the agent, it's much more difficult. For example, let's suppose that the agent didn't know what he was doing. Let's say the action had bad consequences or broke a rule, but he didn't know what he was doing. So then you want to know, why didn't he know what he was doing? Should he have known? Did he have a responsibility to investigate or not? So if he had no responsibility to investigate and didn't know what he was doing, then he'll suffer no bad consequences for the action at all, because he's not responsible for it. And if he did, and if he had some responsibility, how serious was the responsibility? And when he made the decision, was it an easy decision? We talked about this the other day. Right? Was it an easy decision or was it a difficult decision? Was he facing a motivational uphill battle against certain elements in his character which are difficult to control? These are not things that a human being can assess about another human being, nor can a human being assess it about himself either. Ask any psychologist. They'll be very happy to tell you that you don't know yourself. That's why you have to pay me so that I can teach you who you are. So, and I think that they may have goodwill and good intentions, but I don't trust their results. So I think that we should simply acquiesce to the idea that no human being can say about any human being, this was a hard decision or an easy decision, and this is something that you should have done, and therefore you get a lot of demerit for failing, or only a little, or you get a lot of credit for that victory. Only, Maimonides says, only God can assess that. So, I look at a person, I say, he did this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. This guy ought to be out of the world, according to the Maimonides, and he's still breathing and functioning. So he'll be told 2 things. Number 1, you don't know his whole history. And number 2, you don't know how to weigh up these actions that you see on your own. There's a famous story, of which I only remember a piece. There was someone in town who was known as very stingy. Even people came for charity, never gave. When he died, the people weren't going to go to the funeral. They felt he was not a worthy person. So Rabbi Yitzchak himself went, because he went, he was the Rav of the town, other people went also. But people were surprised. And they said to him, why did you go and honor this person who really had such bad character? He said, well, I'll tell you why. Because he came before me several times in an adjudication of Jewish law, and he lost each case. And because he lost each case, that's why I came to the funeral. Now they were more puzzled. You know, if he lost the case, it means he's in the wrong. If he's in the wrong, why should you go to the funeral? So here was one of the cases. A man was having trouble making a living, and he was married, he had a couple of kids, and he said to his wife, I have to make a trip for a few days, but he didn't go for a few days. He went several hundred miles to a big city where there was a big market, and he said to his wife, while I'm gone, no, he did tell, I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. He told her he's going away for months or maybe years. He's got to make significant money. While I'm gone, there's this fellow in town, go every Friday, and he'll give you money for the week so that you'll be able to live the week. Well, he was lying. He just wanted to get out of town without his wife, cutting his throat. So he told her this story, and he left. Okay, maybe that was Tuesday. Now, Friday morning, she walks into this fellow, the fellow who died. She walks in and she says, hello, I'm so-and-so. And he says, really? Okay. And she says, I came for my weekly support. So this guy puts it together. Wait a minute. She must have been told. Nobody told me. She must have been told. So he said, oh, yes, right, I have it for you. And he gave her money, and he gave her money every week. Every week. Guy came back years later, the husband. Comes back, he's made money. Now he can pay the debts and so forth and so on. But he's expecting a greeting from his wife that he might not survive, right? Because she's probably been begging the whole time, because he was lying. He walks into the house. Oh, how wonderful that you came back, and wonderful to see you, and it's lovely, and I'm seeing that you were successful. I'm so happy for both of us. And he thinks, something's funny here. Something's funny here. That's not the greeting I was expecting. So he goes to the guy, and he said, did you really support her? Every Friday you gave her money? He says, yes, I did. Why did you do that? Because when she came in and she asked for it, I saw that she expected it. I knew she wouldn't have made it up. So I figured you must have told her. And she obviously needed the money. So I gave it to her. So the husband is full of gratitude and full of admiration that the guy went out of his way and did that. And he said, well, I want you to know, I went, I was successful, I have money, so tell me how much it is and I'm going to pay it back. And the rich fellow said, I want the mitzvah. I don't want it back. I didn't give it as a loan. I gave it to support her. I want the mitzvah. The husband said, listen, I didn't even tell you that it was going to happen, and but I have the money. I want to pay back what you gave to my wife. So this was the din Torah. This was the adjudication that came before Rabbi Yitzchak. The rich man doesn't want the money back. And the husband wants to pay. And Rabbi Yitzchak found in favor of the husband and told him, you're wrong and you have to take the money. And that's the case that he lost. And that's why the Rav went to his funeral. Because he knew what he did privately. He, the rich man, didn't want to have a reputation of being a tzaddik, of being righteous, of being outstanding, of being very frum. He didn't want that reputation, so he did it privately. And there were other cases like that, which he did privately. And only the Rav knew. So when people in the town looked at him, he's a bum. He's a bum. It doesn't give basic support to people who need it. But he was. He just did it in private. So when the Rambam is telling us two things. First of all, you don't know the whole record. And number two, even if you do know the record, you don't know how to weigh up the significance of the record. I want to illustrate that with something which comes from Rav Nachman of Breslov. There's a mission that says you should judge every person favorably. So the difficulty with that Mishnah, which the commentators talk about, is I saw him do what he did. I saw it with my own eyes. I know it's illegal. What am I supposed to do? Pretend that it's legal? Or pretend I didn't see what I saw? I know he committed a crime. What am I supposed to do in judging him favorably when I know that it's a crime? So I'll give you an illustration of what Rav Nachman Breslov says, because I saw this myself. My Rebbe, the Boston Rebbe Zatzal, I used to daven in his shul in Brookline, Massachusetts. One morning, after davening, someone who prayed there with everybody came up and started yelling at the Rebbe. It was unbelievable. In shul, in public, yelling. I couldn't take it. So I pushed myself in between the two of them, facing this fellow, and I just marched him out of the door. I pushed him, step by step out of the door. I turned back to the Rebbe. The Rebbe was calm, really calm. So I said to him, Rebbe, that kind of provocation, that kind of unsolicited, undeserved provocation, and you're so calm. He said, yes, I am calm, because I know what's going on at home. Oh, he knows what's going on at home. He knows what kind of pressure this guy's under. He knows the battles this guy is fighting. I don't know that. So he did something wrong, but how wrong is it? Well, when a person is struggling with all sorts of problems and temptations and provocations, it's not as wrong as someone who does it in cold blood, or does it in the grips of a false ideology. All of the person's inner character has to be taken into account to judge the significance of the action in terms of the agent, not the action as an event in the public sphere, but in the identity of the agent. That's what the Rambam is saying. And for that, it's not so obvious that you have observational evidence against this rule, that when a person slips over the 50% mark, you have a person becomes wicked and he will die immediately. And this rule, this analysis for us is extremely important because, and it's important in both directions, because sometimes we are overly lenient on ourselves because we say, I couldn't help it and it was difficult and so on and so on. And sometimes we are overly strict on ourselves, overly self-condemnatory, where we say, I should have done better, and I'm a failure, and I'm guilty, and the person becomes depressed, and sometimes may even give up hope on himself. And in this connection, I want to mention a problem of this type, which is fairly common. People who become interested in traditional Jewish observance at the advanced age of 19, and let's say it's resolved to keep Shabbos, and then they think, let's see, 13 to 19 is 6 years. 6 times 52, where's my calculator? 312. 312 Shabbosos I didn't keep. That's a lot. Talk about being a Shabbos violator. 312 is a really strong record of being a Shabbos violator. So what am I going to do about that? How am I going to face myself and face God when I know I have this terrible record? Well, let's see. As those of you with me from the beginning, remember, you have to do Teshuvah only for a deliberate failure or a negligent failure. Deliberate means you know it's wrong, you know what the stakes are, you know what you're doing, and you do it anyway. Negligent means you didn't know, but you should have known. You had a responsibility to know. The fact that you didn't know shows that you were irresponsible in providing your knowledge. If you decided because you came to an Ohr Somayach summer camp, summer experience, and were introduced to Yiddishkeit for the first time, and now you're interested in keeping Shabbos, and you decide to keep Shabbos, your failures of Shabbos the preceding 6 years were not deliberate. You had no clue what was going on. And they were not negligent because you don't have a responsibility to investigate. Why should you investigate this particular thought system? Because your genes are similar to our genes? That's not a reason to investigate every thought system, especially if you were told, as I was told as a child, that Orthodox Jews are ignorant and superstitious and backward, and they're impoverished and they don't work, and they're against the values of a democratic state, and so on. Then there's nothing there to talk about. We had a boy here a long time ago from Pittsburgh. His family was conservative, and he had an after-school program once or twice a week where they studied some Jewish subjects. One class, the teacher said, I have a friend who's an Orthodox woman, and I've invited her to talk to you, and you can ask her questions. So one of the boys, he told me, he was there, one of the boys said, I understand that there are strings that Orthodox people put on the corners of their garments. What is that, and why do they do that? So she says they're called tzitzis, and she gave some background, and then she said, but nobody does that anymore. Oh, nobody does that anymore. Okay. Should he say, yeah, but she's only one witness. Maybe she's lying, or maybe she's out of touch. I'll go out, I'll Google it, and I'll check it. Why should he do that? She's presented by his teacher as an Orthodox woman. She tells him that nobody does that anymore. He's not negligent if he doesn't check it out further. He, who's 14 or something. So these past 6 years of Shabbosos are something for which you are not required to do Teshuvah, because you're not responsible for the failure. And that means you shouldn't beat yourself up over failures like that. Only when you decided deliberately to do it, knowing that it's wrong and knowing what you're doing, which are two different things, Or you knew something was in the air. You knew something was connected here. It may, there's a suspicion that there are some rules that deal with this case, and you could have looked them up, and you didn't. Then you need to do tshuva, but otherwise not. Question? Yeah.
How can one do tshuva for deliberately breaking Shabbos? Like knowing, like when going to yeshiva and everything, and knowing that as a Jew you must keep Shabbos, but you break, like you don't keep it anyway, and then.
How can one do tshuva for deliberately breaking Shabbos? Let me tell you that in the Tanakh you have cases of doing tshuva for murder, or doing tshuva for idol worship. Menashe was a king who for decades sponsored idol worship, promoted idol worship, instituted idol worship in the temple. He did tshuva and his tshuva was accepted. So we have a rule, Ein davar omed b'fnei tshuva. Nothing stands in the way of tshuva. I should be careful to say this correctly. When a person does tshuva, it solves all problems. Doesn't follow that everyone can always do tshuva. That's a separate issue that we'll come to in the Rambam. Sometimes the Kodesh Baruch Hu stops a person from doing tshuva. But when tshuva is done, it solves all problems. Tshuva overpowers any and all failures. Even idol worship, even failures that carry a death penalty or carry the penalty of being cut off from God. All of those penalties, divine penalties only apply to a person who didn't do tshuva. If he did tshuva, he escapes those divine penalties. So no matter how serious the crime, tshuva works. The fact that it works is a bit of a paradox and a mystery. I will talk about that in an evening session one time. But that's the guarantee.
Can I ask what's considered tshuva in this case?
Okay, so you came in now. The definition of tshuva, roughly, we spent a few days on this. It's in chapter 2, paragraph 2. The definition of tshuva is stopping to do the action, at least temporarily, and resolving in your heart not to do it, resolving in your heart, though you may not succeed, and regretting what you've done, and confessing. Those are the elements of tshuva. If you do all three of those, you lose responsibility for that action. Even if later you lose your resolve, but if the resolve was sincere and honest, then that's how you do tshuva for any transgression. Any and all transgressions get the same definition of what it is to do tshuva. Other things may have to happen in addition for the kapara to take place, but as I said then, the guarantee is that if you do tshuva, you leave the world clean. You leave the world clean. Yes? I thought you had a question. No, okay. Okay, that's halachas aleph and beis. Now, okay, I just mentioned this, and I'll leave it as a puzzle to figure out why it is. A person, anyone, who regrets mitzvos that he did, and he discards or degrades the merits that he acquired by doing those mitzvos. And he says in his heart, what good did it do me that I performed those mitzvos? What do I need it for? It was a mistake. I wasted my time. I hadn't done it. Then he loses the merit for them. And when he comes to be judged, they don't count it in his favor. And he quotes a verse for that. Now, this is the parallel to doing tshuva. When a person does tshuva, he has this crime in his past, he does tshuva, we spoke about this, then it gets subtracted from his record. As he says, Maimonides says, one of the things that a person who does tshuva does is change his name as if to say, it wasn't I who did it. So you can detach yourself from the past event. Here you can do the same thing for merits, for mitzvos, for good deeds. You can detach yourself from that event so that it doesn't count as part of your record anymore. So there's a symmetry there between the two of them. That, it would seem, makes sense. The question that the commentators ask is, in the case of Teshuvah, there are 3 requirements, and in the case of detaching yourself from the past merit, is only 1. Here, it's only regret. It's only regret. And that removes the merit from the good action for the person who did it. In the case of doing Teshuvah with respect to bad action in the past, he has to regret, but he also has to change his behavior. He has to change his inner orientation, to change his priorities. So it sounds like it's much harder to lose responsibility for a transgression than it is to lose merit for a mitzvah. But we have a general principle that rules that out. And the general principle is that God's attribute of mercy is much more powerful, extensive, applicable, and rich than his attribute of punishment. So here it seems like the relationship between losing the connection to the past crime versus losing the connection to the past mitzvah violates that principle. It's very easy to lose merit, and it's very hard to lose crime. That sounds to me like God's attitude is very strict. You committed a crime, you're stuck. You're stuck. You want to get out of it? Work hard. Make an effort. You did a mitzvah, with a snap of the finger, you lose it. That sounds like God is very strict, that he's much more punishment-oriented than he is reward-oriented. So we have to understand what the meaning of this comparison is. We'll talk about that in Hashem tomorrow.